In this video, we're going to try to look at Kant's solution to Hume's problem. And there's all kinds of levels of complexity to this. And the goal here is not to make it complex, it's to provide sort of an understanding of the issue. So there's a lot of technical jargon, and there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. So I propose the way to look at it is to think about the problem of cause and effect, and what Kant's program is doing to sort of answer that problem. So again, it's a very complex issue. There's a lot of terminology, but you can kind of see the problem that Hume presents, and you can kind of see the solution that Kant grants, without really having to know all the details. And this is actually really significant in the history of philosophy and the history of modern science. So basically, Hume's problem, let's talk about the relationship of cause and effect. For Hume, the question of causality, or the relation of cause and effect, is not something that we can really discuss. It's not, there's no necessary connection between an event's cause and its effect. If everything we know, if all knowledge comes from experience, the question of cause and effect is not something that's present. So let's take a simple example. Let's say I have a set of dominoes lined up. You know, you push the one and they all fall down. If I push the one and I watch it hit the next one, it hits the next one, they keep knocking them down. Now in normal language we would say something simply like, well, when I knocked down the first domino, it caused the second domino to fall. And the fact that the second domino is falling, it's basically an effect of the previous cause. That is, the first domino is falling. That's cause and effect. That's how it works. If I punch a window with adequate force, the window will shatter and my hand will be bloodied. The cause and effect. There's a relationship. But if we talk about getting knowledge through experience only, there's nothing about the relationship between the cause and the effect that we experience. That's the issue. So, pushing the first domino and the second domino falling, it's merely a perception of this and a perception of that, and a perception of all intermediary points along that line, however much you want to break that up. Where's the connection? There's no connection in experience. So, I mean, really think about it. Think about it all day long. If you had a video camera and you filmed, you know, the domino knocking over the other domino at 1,000 frames a second and watched each little frame, you can see the movements through time, but there's no necessary connection between those two things. And everybody says, but it's so obvious. But why is it so obvious? Well, Hume says because you've seen it a few times and you just kind of assume that that's the case. But there's nothing adequate in experience to allow for justification or proof that that is necessary. And furthermore, nothing you actually experience is necessary if it's purely based on experience. It's one of the problems that Hume has. So, I mean, that's kind of a big problem, because cause and effect it's the basis for modern physics. It's how we understand everything. And to sort of write it off and say it's merely a habit of the mind and then go along with our daily business, it's not adequate to the task of science. So, by addressing this issue, Kant isn't this isn't sort of an empty philosophical problem. It's sort of a grounding for how we understand our relationship to knowledge. So I'm going to try to leave the technical jargon aside a little bit and just give you the bigger picture thing. You will hear some technical jargon because it's Kant. That's how it is. So Hume's problem arises because he's sort of a radical empiricist, and he thinks all knowledge comes from experience. Now, the issue here that Kant sees is that there's a problem with how he understands what knowledge is. For Hume, and for all radical or just pure empiricists, knowledge, it's acquired through experience, and by experience they mean sense perception. So, object here, right? This is the objective world. The world sort of pushes some sort of thing out, and we experience that thing. It's the causal theory of perception or knowledge. So, I am sort of passive, and the agent is active, and I receive the information, and that's where knowledge comes from. Simple. The issue is that causation, the relationship between a cause and its effect, is not something that seems to come in that same sense. I don't experience it. It doesn't make sense to say that the cause of a domino falling affects the other dominoes falling. It's not something you perceive. You don't sense it. It's not present in experience. But where is it then? Is it really just a habit of mind? And Kant's not really happy with the answer that it's just something we just believe it, and that's fine. Because if we just believe it and that's fine, then, well, physics works because, quote, we just believe it and that's fine, which is pretty silly. But part of the issue is how we understand our relationship to the world. That's the big take out from Kant. So the empirical view, this is the world and this is object, this is subject. Subject sort of perceives the world. Kant says that doesn't really help, and it's not really true. What if the world as I perceive it is, if we just think of it in terms of pure reception, then there's nothing to account for necessity or universality or causation. A lot of things go missing because we don't experience necessity. We don't experience things like that. In a purely empirical world that's only based on sense experience, you can't have an understanding of necessity or universality. It's impossible. You would have to have an infinite amount of experience to understand necessity. Otherwise, all you're doing is sort of compounding experiences over time. And given that we only live, 70 or 80 years, your compounded experiences do not equal necessity. You may be able to abstract from those ideas and, understand a concept of necessity, but it's not adequate. It's always partial. It's not deductive in the same way something coming from pure reason would be. So his answer is to say something, to make it more or less quick. We're not merely receptive in terms of how we perceive the world and where our knowledge comes from. A lot of what we do as rational beings with understandings, a lot of what we do has an impact on knowledge in the sense that we help construct, quote, the world that we know. Now that doesn't mean we make the world by thinking or something like, boom, I create the world. No, what we are perceiving may or may not be what the world actually is. That's irrelevant. The perceptions that we're talking about, this is a little bit different. The world as it is could be anything. But what we're perceiving, we assume automatically that that's just sort of all we have, whatever that means, whatever the real world looks like. And these perceptions that are coming in, much like the empiricists, it's sort of this, this information coming at us as subjects. But the difference is, for Kant, there's an aspect that the subject contributes to this, to knowledge. We help process this information, let's say. So the example I give in the text is your mind or your understanding is like a cookie cutter, and the information coming in from the objective world is like all this dough. It's just coming from all directions, and your mind, your understanding is like stamping these images onto it. It's processing the information or making it ready for processing into knowledge. The other example I can sort of give you is, without my glasses, everything is, incredibly blurry. It's just a bunch of noise, colors and sights and all this kind of stuff. When I put these glasses on, they help my eyes break apart the objects and the things that I'm perceiving. And your mind is doing a similar thing when it's processing the information. So the short way of saying this is that there's capacities, or he calls them faculties, of your mind that make understanding of your experience possible, period. And one of the things that Hume doesn't account for, if we're only getting things based on experience, he's not thinking about the contributions that our understanding might be adding. So if you want to look for cause and effect in the world, you're not going to find it because you're bringing it with you. You're sort of adding it when you're perceiving something like two dominoes, interacting with each other. It's coming along with your understanding. It's not something that's in experience. It's something that you need in order to have experience at all. Now, notice that last phrase. It's not merely that Kant says, oh, we just add it to experience. Simple. No, it's not that simple. It's in order to even have experience, we have to have certain sort of, he calls them categories. We have to have certain categories of understanding, and even to understand this nonsense world that's coming at us, period. Here's another example that sort of goes along with that. So if we assume that something like causation or cause and effect is one of these necessary things that we bring to the world, a more interesting one that's related but not quite the same is space and time. Yeah, wow, oh, that's strange. So we usually think of space and time as sort of objective things, right? Well, I'm not saying they're subjective, but they are subjective conditions for objective experience. So if you think of it like this, in order to have experience at all, we need a place to have experience. We need space. And in order to have experience at all, we need a sort of a continuous timeline in order to have it. Time. These are parts of, they're versions of faculties of, not of the understanding, but they're similar, that we bring along with us when we have experience. It's not as strange as it sounds. What Hume doesn't do is he doesn't ask about the possible conditions of knowledge. He just says, well, what do we see and how do we turn that into knowledge? What Kant does is he says, what do we see and how do we turn that into knowledge, and what do we need, first of all, in order to even have those experiences? So all this talk about what a synthetic a priori judgment is, it's a way of thinking about, I'll let you break that down in your discussion, but it's a way of having knowledge to begin with. It's one of the preconditions of knowledge. In order to understand cause and effect, you have to have an understanding of something like, for example, an object in general, just the form of an object. You have to have an understanding, a general understanding, or faculty of space and time. These are not things we experience. These are not things we experience. They are brought into the picture thanks as a result of our understanding. And now, I mean, it may seem, I'm trying to keep this as shallow as possible, and it may kind of sound silly, like we just add these things. But if you really think about it, if we're just merely receiving information, that's to undermine the sort of rationalist idea that there's these, let's say, oh no, innate ideas, that there's some sort of innate faculties that humans or other reasonable beings, and actually, to be quite honest, the cat over here and things like that, they bring too, at least to some degree. We cannot experience something like necessity. You cannot experience universality. Where do we get the concept of number from? But a lot of people don't really think too much about that one. There's all kinds of things in the categories, but even so, for example, even the concept of something like space or time, I mean, those are things you can get from experience, but if you bring them with you, sort of, this is the platform on which experience happens, the explanation is much simpler. And the impact that this had, not just on philosophy but on science, was actually really significant. To understand that we don't generally, we don't form all of the concepts we have based on our experiences, but there's faculties that come along with us before we even have experience. It was huge in sort of areas of linguistic understanding and how our minds actually function. If it weren't the case, then teaching a computer, for example, how to have experiences and to gain knowledge would be a lot easier, because it would just be a compendium of information. Just force-feed it a bunch of information, it would generate concepts. That's clearly not the case, because we can't teach computers the same way we learn. We learn very quickly, because we have these possible faculties. We have these things that allow us to interpret information in a certain way. So when I see a cause and effect, I can make a judgment that that caused that to happen, because the idea of a causal relationship between two events in general is something that I'm required to have in order to have knowledge at all. It's very interesting. All right, I'm sure there'll be more questions about that. We'll follow up in the discussion.